Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
Sound Cartel.
From Sound Cartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. It wasn't that long ago that blatant and unwarranted comments and advances in the workplace were brushed aside and seen as par for the course. Rightly so, they're now being taken a lot more seriously, with rules and regulations tightening and people being far more willing to call out the harassment. So, as a leader, why should you care and what can you do about it? For answers, we hear from Yan Flageul, HR advisor at Mazars, and Greg Halse, partner at Mazars. Yan explains to Chris Ashmore that it's the impact that these behaviours have on those being targeted.
You know, what's interesting is that ultimately people are people. They're just human beings. And whether they're in the workplace or outside of the workplace, it's the way that people interact with each other, either positively or negatively, and the impact that sometimes words and actions can have on people. And one of the interesting thing about, and that'll be the only touch point on definition, is the fact that harassment, the intent is irrelevant. Whether you intended to offend someone or not, or to intimidate or humiliate, is irrelevant to the matter. It's the fact you actually have made an impact negatively on someone, and most of the time you've made an impact on their health and safety. And that's why it's actually prohibited by law. And that's ultimately about how people behave and what they need to be aware of their surroundings, aware of the impact that their words and actions can have. That's really what this is about.
There have been changes to the Fair Work Act in relation to sexual harassment in the workplace. Greg, if I can turn to you, what's driven those changes, do you think?
It's interesting, and Yan, I'm not sure what you would think about this, but for decades I've been proud of the way in which we've managed businesses in Australia. It's felt like our cultures were always about a fair go, accepting diversity, emphasising, we'll help each other when we're under the pump, we'll help the mateship element that's in the workplace. So for decades we've been known around the world to survive with banter and jibes and being a bit of a larrikin, and that's been a core feature of the Australian workplace. And it's interesting that for decades we haven't seen the wave of harassment claims that are suddenly starting to appear. And in the past, whilst we've had all the policies in place and the values stuck up on walls, it hasn't really been a big thing to worry or manage. And I don't know what you're noticing in the change, Yan, in terms of the context.
Well, I've been in Australia for 17 years, so long enough to actually call it home and understand the culture, And what I've noticed is that there is really a shift in society overall, not just in workplaces, but overall the Me Too movement, for instance, has been really a driver to that change. The fact that things that were in the past considered as acceptable, which, by the way, were never acceptable, but they were just falling under the radar, never really noticed. And a lot of people would not actually react and speak up or call out on these behaviours that can really be harmful.
It's almost like, was it only 17% of people actually deal with
It's incredible,
harassment?
The amount of issues of sexual violence or sexual harassment that go unreported. It's actually, 83% of them never go reported. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. And the fact that primarily people don't feel safe to report. They don't feel safe because they don't necessarily trust the system. And that's, I think, where Commissioner Jenkins and her team, with the Respect at Work report that she submitted to the government, has made a massive impact. And it's interesting to see that the Attorney General has vouched to fully implement all of the 55 recommendations. So things are changing from a global society point of view, and it's worldwide. You look at even artist shows, and I'm going to name one that I used to really like, and Little Britain. And the artists themselves actually saying now, because the show has been removed from air, and they're themselves saying, do you know what? If we had realized, we would have not done these jokes. They were not probably good jokes to start with. And it's interesting that conscience that people have now that, wow, we've gone wrong. But now we realize how wrong we were. And it's time that it stops. And it's time that the society changes and becomes a better place for people.
And in terms of the real impacts, I mean, you and I in the last 3 months, Yan, we've been seeing examples of real workers being surprised, injured, dismissed, and they haven't understood that the world has changed around them, and they thought it was always okay to behave in a certain way, but suddenly they're being caught up in this shift. But it's not only the workers, I guess. I even have examples of senior managers suddenly getting formal sanctions for behaviours that in the past would have been ignored.
Yeah, it's called vicarious liability, which basically if your workers are actually behaving against the law, as an employer, you will be held responsible. And that's something that has hurt a lot of companies. And now with the changes to the Fair Work Act, which officially prohibits sexual harassment in the workplace, it gives a lot more power for workers to actually raise complaints and have a voice that is heard. And employers really need to do everything they can. And actually it is phrased really, there is a part of the wording that is critical, is employers need to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And the emphasis is on the all. There are actually interesting court cases.
So has that changed then? It didn't used to be all?
Well, it used to be that you had to take reasonable steps.
Yeah.
And now they are really saying you need to take all reasonable steps. That means that if you look at a company, and all companies will have different resources, different amount of money they can work with, but ultimately at their level, have they done everything they can to prevent sexual harassment? That'll be the difference between being vicariously liable or not if this actually goes to court.
And so what are some practical steps business owners can take to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace? Your thoughts, Yan?
Well, for as much as there are still some grey areas to define what all means when you talk about all steps. But ultimately, I would say that it is pretty safe to say that you must have a policy. You must have the rules of the house, basically, and stating clearly that if you are breaking the rules, there will be consequences. That is critical. You need to have that in place. But you need to also, and I really believe that the key answer to the problem is in education. You need to train your staff. You need to train your managers, and in particular, you need to train your middle managers to help them, one, anticipate the issues. That means assess where is the risk. What are actually the people in my organization that are more at risk than others?
So that's a psychosocial hazard
Psychosocial
check.
hazards, exactly, check assessments. And then have these corrective measures in place to make sure that you prevent the harm from happening. But also educating people on what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. What does that mean, that joke? You can no longer have that sort of jokes. It's not the fun police. It's the fact that there are jokes that were just never okay. But now you will actually possibly be sanctioned for some jokes, banters, that you would not think much of. And that's because the intent is usually irrelevant. If you've actually impacted negatively on the health and safety of someone, you will actually have consequences. And I think that the training is one thing, but also the fact that at executive level, you need to look at the culture and how to really help people embrace a positive culture. And the culture is a culture of speak up and call out. You have zero tolerance for these sorts of negative behaviors. And I always say that the standard that you walk past is the standard that you accept. So that's what needs to be the benchmark, is we need to have a higher level of standards with regards to sexual harassment in the workplace.
Indeed. Well, before we go, any final thoughts you'd like to share, Yan?
Do you know what is interesting is that you look at the cost, the underlying cost of mental health claims, and how at the moment we know that there were articles in The Age talking about how the work cover system is broken and it becomes unsustainable because statistically, the cost of a mental health claim will be 5 times greater than the cost of a physical claim. And that's because it takes 5 times longer to recover to start with. So what is really important for employers is the fact that they need to understand that the way to help the system to actually work and for people to still be able to be protected, you need to work upstream, work at the beginning.
So
before
almost be
the issues.
proactive rather than preventative here. And
100%.
I think proactivity is all about building a culture that says you're okay, I'm okay, that we actually have a relationship in the workforce that is respectful, appropriate, and not parent-child, you know what I mean, about parent and where one is dominating the other. This really needs to be a place where you leave your privileges at the door and you genuinely have candid, direct but caring conversations with your employees.
That was Mazars' Greg Halse and Yan Flageul. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at Sound Cartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast.
Sound Cartel.
This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.